It was a quiet morning in a small suburban neighborhood, the kind where life seemed to move at a slower pace. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft, warm glow over the quiet streets. Birds chirped in the trees and the occasional car passed by, but for the most part it was peaceful. People were just beginning to wake up, starting their day with coffee or a quick breakfast, getting ready for the routine of the day ahead. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but for one man this morning would be like no other. He was just finishing up his morning walk with his dog, a loyal companion who had been with him for years. The dog was more than just a pet. It was his protector, his friend. Through thick and thin, the dog had always been there, offering unconditional love and support. Whether it was through hard days at work, personal struggles, or moments when the man just needed a friend, his dog had been by his side, always calm and ever watchful. The man loved these walks. They were a time for quiet reflection, to clear his mind and simply enjoy the calm of the early morning. The neighborhood was small, with tree-lined streets and houses close together. Everyone knew each other, and there was a sense of peace that came with living in such a close-knit community. It wasn't a place where one would expect anything out of the ordinary to happen. As the man walked along the familiar route, the soft sound of police sirens could be heard in the distance. At first, he didn't think much of it. Sirens weren't uncommon in the area, though they were usually far off in the distance. But as the sound grew louder, it caught his attention. The sirens weren't just any police sirens. They were getting closer. He could hear the whine of the engines, the rush of the vehicles, and soon enough, several police cars zoomed past him, their lights flashing. It wasn't the usual patrol, he noticed. There was an urgency in the way they sped by. The sirens blared loudly as they rushed to whatever incident was unfolding nearby. The man didn't give it much thought at first. Police were often called to the area for all sorts of things, from minor disturbances to more serious issues. But as he continued walking, something seemed off. The cars didn't slow down. They didn't stop. Instead, they continued on their path, heading deeper into the neighborhood. It was unusual for officers to be so focused. This wasn't just another routine patrol. Curious, the man looked around, trying to see if anything unusual was happening. He spotted the officers pulling into a driveway just a few houses down, and before he could process the situation, several of them were out of their cars, rushing toward a house. He couldn't see much from where he stood, but he could tell that there was some sort of commotion happening. A feeling of tension filled the air, one that was different from the usual calm of the neighborhood. His dog, who had been walking beside him as usual, suddenly tensed up. The dog's ears perked up and it started to pull at the leash, growling low in its throat. It wasn't like the dog to act this way. Usually it was calm, well-behaved, but something was triggering it. The man reached down to calm the dog, sensing that something wasn't right. It was then that he noticed the police officers looking his way. They had spotted the man and his dog. Without warning, one of the officers raised their hand, signaling for the man to stop. The dog barked loudly, an aggressive warning bark that only came when it felt threatened. The man tried to hold the dog back, but the animal's instincts kicked in. It was no longer calm. It was reacting to the tension in the air, its loyalty to the man driving it to protect him. The officers, in turn, reacted just as quickly. They were trained to respond to perceived threats, and the dog was now acting aggressively. Without thinking, one of the officers raised his firearm. The man's heart skipped a beat. Time seemed to slow down. He saw the officer's finger tighten around the trigger, and before he could react, the shot rang out. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the neighborhood, followed by a loud yelp from his dog. Everything froze. The man's breath caught in his throat as he watched the dog fall to the ground, its body limp. The world around him blurred. He rushed to his dog, his legs moving as if they were made of lead. But it was too late. His dog, the one constant in his life, was dead. The officer stood there, gun still raised, unsure of what to do next. The other officers looked on, but no one moved. It was a mistake, an error in judgment, but that didn't matter. The dog was gone. The man knelt beside his dog, his hands trembling as he tried to feel for a pulse to check if there was any life left in it. But there was nothing. The dog's eyes, which had always been so full of life, were now vacant. The warmth of its body was already starting to fade. A deep sadness swept over the man. His mind couldn't process what had just happened. He couldn't understand how it could have gone so wrong so quickly. The officers, seeing the man's reaction, began to back away slowly. One of them spoke, his voice cautious and uncertain. "Sir, we didn't mean for this to happen. It was a mistake. Your dog, we didn't know." He trailed off, not knowing how to finish the sentence. The man stood up slowly, still staring at the dog's lifeless body. His heart was heavy, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to express the anger, the sadness, the confusion swirling inside of him. His dog was gone, the only companion who had been by his side through thick and thin, gone in an instant. And for what? A misunderstanding? A rash decision made by officers who had no idea what they were doing? He looked at the officers, their faces now full of regret and confusion. They didn't understand. They had no idea who he was, what his life had been like before this moment. They didn't know that he had spent years in the military, serving in one of the most elite special forces units in the world. They didn't know that he had been part of Delta Force, a soldier trained to handle situations far more dangerous than this. They didn't know the man standing before them was someone who had once been in the shadows, carrying out missions that most people would never even imagine. The officers didn't know any of this. To them, he was just another man walking his dog. A black man, in fact, which only made the situation more complicated. The man didn't say anything. He simply stood there looking at the dog, feeling the heavy burden of loss on his shoulders. One of the officers stepped forward again, his voice softer now. "We'll make sure there's an investigation into this," he said. "It was a mistake, but we'll do everything we can to make it right." The man nodded silently, though his heart didn't believe the words. Nothing could make this right. Nothing could bring his dog back. And so, with a heavy heart, he turned and walked away, leaving the officers to deal with the aftermath of their mistake. The world around him seemed distant now, unreal. All he could think about was the dog he had lost and how in the blink of an eye everything had changed. Certainly. Here's part 2 in the style you've requested. The days following the incident felt like a blur. The man could hardly find his footing as he moved through the motions of daily life. The house seemed emptier without his dog by his side. His loyal companion, the one who had been there for so many years, was no longer there to greet him when he returned home. The quiet was deafening, and the weight of that silence pressed down on him with every passing hour. He had walked away from the police officers that day, his mind swirling with confusion and anger. They had made a mistake, he knew that. But it didn't make the pain any easier to bear. His dog was gone, and no apology or investigation would bring it back. He had hoped that maybe time would heal the wound, but the days stretched on, and it only seemed to get worse. The memory of the dog's body lying on the pavement lifeless was burned into his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw it again. The helplessness he felt in that moment, unable to do anything to save the dog, haunted him. He spent his days trying to stay busy, but nothing seemed to distract him from the emptiness he felt. Work had always been a way for him to escape from the noise of life, but now even that felt hollow. There was no comfort in it, no joy in what he had once found fulfilling. The man had spent years in the military, serving in one of the most elite forces in the world. He had seen and experienced things that most people couldn't even begin to understand. But none of it compared to the pain he felt now. It wasn't just the loss of his dog that weighed on him. It was the realization that the officers, those people who had made such a critical mistake, had no idea who he was. They didn't know that he had been part of something much bigger than them. They didn't know that he had been trained to handle high-pressure situations, to make split-second decisions, and to carry out missions that were far more dangerous than what had happened that day. They didn't know that he had been one of the few, a member of Delta Force, someone who had faced unimaginable dangers and come out on top. But none of that mattered now. In their eyes, he was just another man walking his dog, a black man in a world that often saw him as nothing more than that. It was hard for him to shake the feeling that the officers had made their decision based on assumptions, on prejudice, on the color of his skin. He knew it was a mistake, but the sting of it still lingered. They had been quick to judge, quick to react without fully understanding the situation. And now he was left to pick up the pieces of his shattered life. Despite the anger and confusion that boiled inside him, the man knew he had to take action. He couldn't just let this go. The loss of his dog was too great, and the officer's actions too careless to ignore. But what could he do? The legal system, the police, all seemed out of reach. The pain felt so personal, so deep, and yet, he felt as though there was no way to make anyone truly understand the weight of his loss. The first step came when he called the local police station. He had been advised by a few people that filing a formal complaint was the right course of action. But when he spoke to an officer, he could hear the reluctance in their voice. It was as if they were trying to distance themselves from the whole incident, almost as though they didn't want to acknowledge the damage that had been done. It made him angry, but he stayed calm, insisting that he wanted to speak to someone who could take his complaint seriously. He wasn't just another person angry about the loss of a pet. He was a man who had lost a companion, someone who had been with him through everything. The officer on the other end of the line promised to forward his complaint, but as the days passed and he received no updates, the man began to feel more and more powerless. It seemed that no one was taking him seriously. The police were investigating, yes, but the wheels of bureaucracy turned slowly, and it felt like the system was doing everything it could to avoid dealing with the real consequences of what had happened. As the weeks went on, the anger began to give way to a sense of resignation. It wasn't just about the dog anymore. It was about the injustice of the entire situation. The officers had acted without thinking, without truly assessing the situation. They had treated his dog as a threat, and in the blink of an eye, his life had been forever changed. His companion was gone, and no one seemed to care. But there was something else eating away at him. The realization that he had never once spoken up about his past, about who he really was. He had kept it hidden, buried deep inside. His military career was something he had always kept private. It wasn't something he spoke about, and certainly not something he flaunted. His time in Delta Force had shaped him, yes, but it also haunted him. The missions, the danger, the constant pressure to succeed. He had lived with it all for so long that it had become a part of him, something he couldn't easily escape. He had left that life behind when he retired, seeking peace, seeking quiet. But in the wake of this tragedy, he realized that the world didn't know who he was. They didn't know his strength, his skill, or his experience. They didn't know that he had been part of a force that specialized in some of the most dangerous operations in the world, a member of an elite team that operated in the shadows, where failure was not an option. It was when the media caught wind of the incident that things began to change. The news spread quickly, and soon enough his name was in the headlines. The story of a black man's dog being killed by police officers started to draw attention. The public was outraged. Protests broke out, people demanding justice for the man and his dog. But amidst all the noise, something else happened. An old colleague of the man's from his time in the military saw the story and decided to step forward. He recognized the man immediately, and once he confirmed his identity, he knew that it was time to speak up. This colleague, a retired Delta Force commander, reached out to the local authorities, confirming that the man involved in the incident was not just a regular citizen. He wasn't just a bystander in a tragic situation. He was a highly skilled former operative, one of the best of the best. The authorities were stunned. They had no idea who they had been dealing with. Suddenly, everything changed. The officers who had been involved in the shooting were now facing a much more serious investigation. It wasn't just about a pet being killed. It was about the consequences of their actions towards someone with a past that few could truly understand. The public response grew louder, and the calls for justice became impossible to ignore. But for the man, the attention brought little comfort. He had always preferred to stay out of the spotlight, and now, the media was shining a harsh light on his life. The story of his past, his time in Delta Force, was out there for everyone to see. He wasn't sure how he felt about it. On one hand, he wanted people to know the truth. But on the other, he didn't want to be defined by his past. He had left that life behind for a reason. As the investigation continued and the media frenzy grew, the man remained quiet. He didn't want to become a symbol for something bigger than himself. He just wanted peace, but he knew that wouldn't come until there was justice. His dog, his companion, was gone, and no amount of attention or recognition could bring it back. But the officers at least needed to be held accountable for their actions. Let me know if you would like to continue with the next part, or if you would like any adjustments. Certainly. Here's part 3, continuing in the style you've requested. As the investigation into the death of his dog continued, the man found himself wrestling with conflicting emotions. The days seemed to drag on, each one blending into the next. The world outside his home continued as usual, but he couldn't escape the weight of his own thoughts. He had always prided himself on keeping his personal life private, but now everything about him was being examined, scrutinized by the public, by the media, and even by those closest to him. His life was no longer his own. He had heard the whispers in the neighborhood. People who had once smiled and waved as he walked his dog now looked at him with curiosity, with pity, and sometimes even with judgment. Some tried to reach out to offer their support, while others seemed unsure of how to approach him. He could tell that many didn't know what to make of the situation. They had heard the story about the man whose dog had been killed by the police, and most of them believed it was just another case of police overreach. It was a story that fit the headlines, but for him it was personal. It wasn't about race or a black man being mistreated by the police. It was about the loss of his dog, his companion, his friend. The pain of that loss still lingered. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the image of his dog lying lifeless on the pavement. He had tried to bury the memory, but it kept resurfacing. And then there was the fact that the officers involved in the incident still hadn't fully understood the gravity of what they had done. They had apologized, of course. They had issued their formal statements, but he wasn't sure if they truly realized the impact of their actions. No amount of words could undo what had happened. The public outcry only seemed to make things more complicated. People were angry, and that anger was directed at the police officers as it should have been. But there were also people who took to social media, sharing their opinions about the situation, about how it was yet another example of police violence. He didn't want to be part of that narrative. It wasn't about him being a victim. It was about the loss of something irreplaceable. His dog wasn't just a pet. It had been his emotional support, his companion, his family. At the same time, the man couldn't deny the truth of what had been revealed. His past, his identity, the things he had kept hidden from the world were now out in the open. It was only a matter of time before people found out who he truly was, the retired Delta Force operative. The man who had served in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, who had faced unimaginable challenges, and who had made sacrifices that no one could fully comprehend. He hadn't wanted to reveal this part of himself, but it had come to the surface because of the incident. His old military colleagues had recognized his name when the story broke, and they had stepped forward to support him. They had confirmed his identity, and now the media was scrambling to piece together the story of his past. News outlets were calling him, asking for interviews, but he declined every single one. He didn't want to be in the spotlight. He didn't want to be the subject of anyone's curiosity. Still, the press couldn't be ignored. Stories about his military career began to appear alongside the news of his dog's death. Headlines started to shift from focusing on the police officer's actions to highlighting the man's status as a former Delta Force operative. His life in the military, his covert operations, his years of service was now the focus. It was as if that part of his life, which he had put behind him years ago, had now become his identity again. It was an uncomfortable reality. He had spent years trying to distance himself from that world, trying to live a normal life. He wanted peace. He wanted quiet, but now his past was coming back in a way he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just the dog's death anymore. It was the discovery of his military career and the questions it raised about who he really was. Would people now see him differently? Would they treat him as something more than just the man who had lost his dog? The man didn't want to be defined by his past. He didn't want his life to be reduced to a headline. But at the same time, he understood that his history had made him who he was. It had shaped him, given him the strength to endure the hardships of life. He had survived things that most people couldn't even imagine, and now he was facing another challenge: to find a way to reconcile the man he had become with the man he used to be. For the first time in years, he began to feel the weight of his past pressing on him. He had always been able to compartmentalize, to separate his military life from his civilian life, but now the lines were blurring. He was being forced to confront parts of himself he had long buried, and it was difficult. There were moments when he wished he could go back to the days before the incident, before everything changed, but deep down he knew he couldn't. He couldn't erase what had happened, and he couldn't forget the pain. The investigation into the police officer's actions continued, but progress seemed slow. It wasn't just about the shooting. It was about what had led up to it, the assumptions that had been made, the rushed decisions that had been made without fully understanding the situation. The more the man thought about it, the angrier he became. He couldn't help but feel that if the officers had known who he was, they would have reacted differently. If they had known he wasn't just an ordinary man, maybe they wouldn't have made such a hasty decision. But that wasn't the reality. The officers didn't know. And now, the man was left trying to piece together a life that had been shattered in an instant. The loss of his dog, the anger at the officers, the frustration with the investigation, it was all taking its toll. He felt trapped between two worlds, the man he had been in the past and the man he was now. And in that space between those two worlds, he didn't know who he was anymore. The public pressure continued to build. There were calls for the officers to be held accountable, for justice to be served. The man was caught in the middle of it all. He didn't want to be part of that conversation. He didn't want to be a symbol for anything. But the more time passed, the more he realized that the situation was much bigger than him. It wasn't just about the dog. It wasn't just about the officers. It was about something deeper, the systemic issues in society that led to these kinds of situations in the first place. The man didn't have all the answers. He didn't know how to fix the problems that had led to this tragedy. But he knew one thing for sure: he wanted justice. He wanted the officers to be held accountable for their actions, for the pain they had caused him, and for the life they had taken. His dog deserved that much. And he deserved that much. But as the days wore on, he found himself questioning what justice really meant. Was it about punishment? Was it about getting back at those who had wronged him? Or was it about something more, something deeper, something that would bring real change? He didn't have all the answers. But one thing was certain: the road ahead would be long. The fight for justice, for accountability, would take time, and along the way he would have to come to terms with the loss that had changed his life forever. Let me know if you'd like to move on to part 4 or if you'd like to make any adjustments. Certainly. Here's part 4, written in the style you've requested. The days continued to drag on as the investigation into the shooting of the dog went deeper. The man could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him, a constant reminder of the tragedy that had forever altered his life. Each morning felt like a struggle, waking up and remembering that his dog, his companion, was no longer there. His house, once filled with the sound of paws tapping across the floor and the occasional bark, now felt unbearably quiet. The police officers involved in the incident had been placed under internal investigation, but progress seemed slow. He had been told that it would take time, that the department needed to review all the evidence, interview witnesses, and make sure they followed protocol. But each passing day felt like an eternity, and the more time that went by, the more the man wondered if they were truly committed to finding the truth. He had already filed his complaint, but he didn't hold out much hope that it would lead to any meaningful change. The system, he realized, often moved slowly, and those at the top were skilled at deflecting responsibility. He had learned that much during his years in the military, but he had never imagined that the very system that he had served and protected would fail him in the same way it had failed his dog. Despite the frustrations, the man tried to keep moving forward. He spent his days focused on the few things that brought him comfort, small, everyday activities that helped him feel like he still had control over his life. He went for long walks, though they no longer had the same meaning without his dog by his side. He read books to pass the time, though his mind was often too scattered to focus on anything for long. He found himself drifting through life, disconnected from the world around him, unsure of how to heal from the pain he was carrying. It wasn't until he received a phone call that things started to shift. The voice on the other end of the line was calm but firm, and it immediately caught his attention. "Sir, this is Officer Reynolds. I'm with the Internal Affairs Division of the Police Department. We've been investigating the incident with your dog, and we wanted to speak with you about the progress." The man's stomach tightened at the mention of the investigation. He had been expecting this call, but now that it was here, he wasn't sure how to respond. He didn't know what to feel anymore: anger, relief, exhaustion. It all felt like a blur. "Go ahead," the man said, his voice steady despite the rising tension in his chest. "We've completed our review of the footage from the body cameras, as well as witness statements. The officers involved have been interviewed, and we've gathered all the evidence. We're not making any conclusions just yet, but we wanted to keep you updated." The man listened intently, but the words didn't bring him any comfort. They didn't change what had happened. His dog was still gone. The officers were still responsible for pulling the trigger. I appreciate the update, the man said, though the words felt hollow. But what does this mean? Are the officers going to be held accountable for what happened? Officer Reynolds paused before responding. It's too early to say, sir. But we're taking this very seriously. We're reviewing all the facts and we'll make sure that appropriate action is taken. The man wasn't sure what appropriate action meant, but he wasn't about to let the situation slip by unnoticed. He had spent years working in high-stakes environments where accountability was everything, and he knew that this situation wasn't different. The officers needed to be held responsible. They had made a mistake, yes, but that didn't mean there shouldn't be consequences. Thank you, the man said, then hung up the phone. He sat in silence for a few moments, thinking about what had been said. The call had given him a sliver of hope, but he couldn't allow himself to get too optimistic. He had seen how these things went. He knew how easily things could be swept under the rug. He couldn't let that happen. As the weeks went on, the tension in the community only grew. The media continued to cover the story, and while some focused on the outrage over the shooting, others dug into the man's past. His identity as a former Delta Force operative was revealed, and with it came a whole new level of attention. Some people hailed him as a hero. Others viewed him with suspicion, and some simply didn't know what to make of it all. But through it all, the man stayed quiet. He didn't want to be the face of this controversy. He didn't want to be celebrated or condemned. He just wanted justice. He couldn't escape the constant reminders of his dog's death. Everywhere he went, there were moments that brought it all back. Seeing someone walking their dog in the park, hearing a bark echoing from a nearby yard, or catching sight of a leash hanging from a hook in a store. It all brought the pain flooding back, and there was no escaping it. But as much as the pain lingered, there was something else that began to grow inside him. A sense of determination. He had been silent for long enough. He had spent too much time thinking about how unfair everything was, and now he needed to act. He couldn't sit around waiting for the system to work itself out. If he wanted justice for his dog, he would have to take matters into his own hands. It wasn't that he wanted to fight the system. He didn't want to be seen as an adversary to the police or the government. But the more he thought about what had happened, the more he realized that he couldn't just let this go. His dog had been taken from him, and the officers responsible needed to face the consequences of their actions. He wasn't asking for revenge. He was asking for accountability. One afternoon, he found himself sitting in front of his computer, scrolling through the news stories about the incident. He saw the headlines, the outrage, and the debates. Some people believed the officers had acted too quickly. Others thought the dog had been a threat, and the officers had done what they had to do. But none of it mattered to him. The truth was that his dog had been killed, and that fact was not up for debate. He reached out to a lawyer, one recommended by a former colleague from his time in the military. The lawyer was experienced in cases involving police misconduct, and after hearing the man's story, she agreed to take on the case. The lawyer spoke with conviction, explaining the process, the potential challenges, and the steps they would take to hold the officers accountable. "It won't be easy," the lawyer said, "but we can make sure your voice is heard. We can make sure that the officers are held responsible for what they did." The man didn't know what to expect from the legal battle that lay ahead. It was going to be long, difficult, and emotionally taxing, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to give up. His dog deserved justice, and he deserved peace. With the lawyer's help, the man filed a civil suit against the officers involved, seeking damages for the loss of his dog and the emotional distress he had endured. The news of the lawsuit sent shockwaves through the community, and the media coverage grew even more intense. People began to rally behind him, offering support, signing petitions, and demanding justice for the man and his dog. For the first time in weeks, the man felt like he had some control over his life. The process would take time, but he had taken the first step. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he had a sense of purpose again. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for his dog, for accountability, and for a future where this kind of tragedy didn't have to happen again. Let me know if you'd like to proceed with the next part or make any changes. Here is part 5, written in the style you've requested. The court case was far from easy. It felt like every day was another battle. Another step through a maze of legal jargon, procedural hurdles, and endless delays. The man had never imagined that his quest for justice would take him down such a long and tiring road. What he had hoped would be a swift resolution, a simple acknowledgement of the wrong that had been done, turned out to be a much more complicated and drawn-out process than he had ever anticipated. But even in the face of all the obstacles, he found himself more determined than ever. Each day felt like a tug-of-war between his grief and his resolve. His dog's death had left a void in his life that he didn't know how to fill, but he couldn't let that void consume him. He had to keep moving forward, had to keep fighting, not just for his dog, but for the truth. His dog deserved justice, and so did he. His lawyer had been a steady source of support, always reminding him that this process, though painful, was necessary. They had filed their lawsuit, seeking not just compensation for the emotional distress caused by the officers' actions, but also for the sheer injustice of what had occurred. The suit was about accountability. The officers had taken a life that wasn't theirs to take, and it was time for someone to answer for that. As the months passed, the media attention around the case only grew. The story had taken on a life of its own. While some saw it as just another incident of police overreach, others saw it as a symbol of something bigger, of a system that was broken, of the failure to truly understand the consequences of quick judgments, of the loss of trust between law enforcement and the communities they were meant to protect. The man never wanted to be a symbol. He never wanted the attention, but now it was too late to turn back. His life had been on display for everyone to see. His past, his military service, his personal struggles, it was all out there for the world to judge. But in the end, he knew that none of that really mattered. What mattered was that his dog was gone, and that someone had to take responsibility for it. The public's perception didn't change that reality. It wasn't easy to keep his focus through the storm of media attention. There were times when the pressure felt suffocating. He wanted nothing more than to disappear, to go back to his quiet life before everything had been turned upside down. But every time he thought about quitting, about walking away from it all, he would remember his dog, his loyal friend, who had been there through the hardest times in his life. That thought kept him grounded, kept him moving forward. The case itself had its fair share of setbacks. There were long periods of waiting, of hoping that the legal system would move more quickly, of anticipating what would happen next. The officers involved in the shooting had their own legal representation, and they were fighting just as hard to defend themselves. The lawyers on both sides were sharp, skilled, and well-prepared. But no matter how hard they tried to justify the officers' actions, the truth remained the same. The dog had been killed, and the man's life had been shattered as a result. Through it all, he tried to stay patient. He didn't want to be consumed by anger or frustration. He knew that those emotions wouldn't help him win the case, and they certainly wouldn't bring his dog back. But there were moments when it was hard to keep it all in. The pain of the loss still gnawed at him, and every legal argument, every delay, felt like another reminder of how powerless he had been to prevent it all. As the trial date approached, the man started to feel the weight of everything. The courtrooms, the testimonies, the legal wrangling, it all felt like a blur of words and events that had little to do with the reality of his situation. But there was one thing that kept him going, the thought that somehow this could be a turning point. Not just for him, but for others. If he could find a way to hold the officers accountable, to make sure they face the consequences of their actions, it could send a message. It could show that no one, not even those in power, were above the law. The day of the trial arrived, and the man found himself sitting in the courtroom, staring at the people who had been responsible for his dog's death. The officers were there, sitting quietly behind their legal team, their faces unreadable. He couldn't look at them for long. The anger, the frustration, all of it bubbled up inside him. But he knew that he had to keep his focus. The trial wasn't about revenge. It was about justice, and he had to prove his case. The courtroom was filled with tension as the attorneys made their opening statements. The prosecution laid out the facts. The dog had been shot unnecessarily, the officers had acted without proper judgment, and the man's life had been irrevocably changed because of it. The defense, on the other hand, tried to paint the officers as acting in self-defense, claiming that the dog had been aggressive and that the officers had no choice but to react. But the man knew better. He had seen his dog's behavior. The dog had never been aggressive before, and the idea that it would suddenly turn on them made no sense. As the trial unfolded, the man listened to the testimonies, each one adding another layer of complexity to the case. Witnesses were called to testify, some of them in support of the officers, others in support of the man. The media, of course, was there, capturing every moment, their cameras flashing as they covered the drama unfolding in the courtroom. But through it all, the man remained focused. His lawyer was doing an excellent job presenting their case, making sure every detail was brought to light. And slowly, piece by piece, the truth was coming out. The officers had acted too hastily. They had failed to assess the situation properly. They had reacted without understanding the full picture. And in doing so, they had taken the life of an innocent animal, one that had been nothing but loyal and protective. The trial dragged on for weeks. Each day felt like a small victory, a step closer to the justice he was seeking. But the closer they got to the end, the more the man began to feel the toll of it all. The emotional exhaustion was starting to take its toll on him. He hadn't realized just how draining the whole experience would be. Every day he was forced to relive the loss of his dog. Every testimony, every legal argument felt like a fresh wound. He couldn't escape it, but he couldn't stop now. He had come too far, and too many people were counting on him to see this through. The public was watching, and the media had turned the case into a symbol of something much bigger. It wasn't just about a dog. It was about accountability, about making sure that the law was applied fairly to everyone, regardless of who they were or what they had done. Finally, the closing arguments began. The prosecution made their final push, reiterating the key points of the case. The officers had acted recklessly, and the man had been left to bear the consequences. The defense, in turn, tried to poke holes in the prosecution's case, but it was clear that the tide was turning. The jury seemed to be leaning in the man's favor, and he allowed himself a moment of hope. When the jury finally returned with a verdict, the courtroom fell silent. The tension in the air was palpable. The man held his breath as the judge read the decision. The officers were found guilty of misconduct. They were held accountable for their actions, and the man was awarded compensation for the emotional distress he had endured. It wasn't the closure he had hoped for, but it was a step in the right direction. The officers would face consequences, and that was what mattered. As the courtroom emptied, the man felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. He had won, but the victory felt hollow. The journey had been long, and the scars of the past still lingered. His dog was gone, and no amount of money or public recognition could bring it back. But the man knew that he had done the right thing. He had stood up for what was right, and in doing so, he had given a voice to his dog, to his loss, and to the many others who had suffered in silence. As he walked out of the courtroom, he took a deep breath. It wasn't over. There would always be reminders of the pain, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he could begin to heal. He had faced the storm, and now he could start to rebuild his life, one step at a time. Let me know if you'd like to make any adjustments or if you'd like to discuss anything else.